A report by Acting Public Protector Gcaleka has found that President Cyril Ramaphosa didn't violate the Executive Ethics Code in relation to the Phala Phala theft. Some opposition parties are now planning to challenge the findings of that report, the EFF going as far as describing it as illogical. To unpack this further, we're joined by Advocate Paul Hoffman. Advocate Hoffman, good evening to you. Thanks for your time tonight. Firstly, just your initial impressions of this particular report by the Acting Public Protector.
Yes, it's certainly been a very long time in the making. Thank you, Kathy, and good evening to your viewers. The Public Protector is really the policeman for the executive branch of government. Her mandate, which is in the Executive Ethics Act, says that she has to investigate any alleged breach of the Code of Ethics, and yet she seems to be washing her hands of a lot of the material that is before her on the basis that the Reserve Bank must look after this, and the exchange control authorities must look after that, and the police must look after the other thing. So I'm afraid she is very vulnerable given the scope of her mandate to police the conduct of those who are bound by the Executive Ethics Code, and that it's likely that the review of her decision that seems to be contemplated by a lot of opposition parties is going to make for some interesting new law.
Advocate Hoffman, let's take a look at that narrow view as you've described it, and I think there have been some who've echoed that sentiment. At the heart of what the Public Protector has really found here is questions around this conflict of interest, and the fact that she believes that when it comes to the definitions of paid work, the president cannot be seen to have, his relationship with this farm cannot be explained as paid work, but rather that he is somebody that has interests in the farm. But in the same breath in that report, she also goes on to say that she doesn't believe that the president was as forthcoming about his true involvement on this farm as what he's let on in the submissions that he's made before her.
Yes, I'm sure he's trying to distance himself, and in fact it's very unfortunate that he's behaved as if he's an accused person in a criminal case rather than an upright member of the executive who has done nothing wrong. It's all taken far too long, and it hasn't done constitutional democracy in South Africa any good at all. But let's get back to your questions. When you talk about conflict of interest, then you need to take a careful look at Section 96 of the Constitution, which is replicated in the Executive Ethics Act, which talks about the risk of a conflict of interest. So there doesn't have to be an actual conflict of interest. There has to be the risk of a conflict of interest. And this came up in the Nkandla matter when Jacob Zuma challenged the binding nature of the remedial action that Thuli Madonsela had ordered in respect of his secure in comfort setup at Nkandla, which was enhanced with taxpayers' money when it shouldn't have been. So remember, what the Public Protector should be looking for is whether anything that was done puts the president at the risk of a conflict of interest. Your second question related to whether he was undertaking paid work by keeping the game farm in one corporate entity and the operations of buying and selling buffalo and Angola cattle in another close corporation, both of which are wholly owned by him. He is the sole member of both, as I understand the factual position from press reports and from what the Public Protector has said as well. Now, the usual position when somebody who is in business and has a lot of commercial interests, shall we say, if we can use a broad term, is that they put their commercial interests into a blind trust so that the risk of a conflict of interest is obviated. And the president did that when he left the world of business. Remember, he was once the Secretary General of the ANC. He did not succeed in his ambitions to become the president after Nelson Mandela, and he then went into the commercial world, or into the political wilderness, you could say. And he rejoined politics as the deputy president of the ANC and became the deputy president of South Africa in the second term of Jacob Zuma's presidency. And at that stage, all of his commercial interests, other than this farm and this operation on the farm, were put into blind trusts because he was alive to the fact that a risk of a conflict of interest would crop up in connection with those activities. But he doesn't seem to have chosen to do so in respect of the cattle and the buffalo and the farm itself. And I think that there's going to be a lot of new law made in these reviews in relation to what is meant when the Constitution and the Executive Ethics Act and the Code itself say that you have to desist from undertaking paid work, which is any paid work, which is very widely framed and could include the buying and selling of livestock or of wild animals. And then, of course, related to that is the question of whether, by continuing to trade in cattle and in buffalo, he was exposing himself to a risk of conflict of interest, which actually materialized when he turned his presidential protection unit into his private investigator to go with somebody from the presidency. I think it was Bajani Chauke who went with General Rueda to Namibia to investigate and to recover the stolen money, or the stolen dollars, I suppose we should say.
So Advocate Hoffman, if I understand you correctly then, because there's some who take the view that the opposition parties are doing what opposition parties do, which is contest the report almost for the sake of it. But if I'm listening and hearing you correctly, you are saying that there are reasonable grounds that this matter should be taken on review, and precisely because of the precedent that then this report of the public protector may set, not just for the current president, but for future presidents of this country.
Yes, it's really a question of interpreting the scope of the Constitution, read with the Code and the Executive Ethics Act. And I haven't even touched on things like hanging on to foreign currency beyond the 30 days that is allowed in law, and also in respect of Section 34 of PRECA, that is the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, which creates in the person of the president as sole member of the closed corporations an obligation to report to the hawks. And he seems to think that it's to report to the police, which is not what the law says. You have to report to the hawks if you are the victim of a crime in which more than 150,000 rands is involved. And obviously, in this matter, there was much more than that involved. So the president gets himself into a terrible knot on those aspects, because clearly the money or the US dollars were kept there beyond the 30-day period, and clearly the hawks have never been told about this burglary. And if the way in which it was handled was a question of abusing the Presidential Protection Unit to turn them into the investigators of the crime, then he's in trouble on that. He's supposed, in terms of his oath of office, he's supposed to obey, observe, uphold and maintain the Constitution and all other law. Now, how you can say you're doing that when you haven't reported the theft to the Hawks and you haven't placed the money in a bank within 30 days is very difficult to understand why those are not covered properly.
Are you surprised? Are you surprised that the public protector has completely cleared the president?
Yes, I think she could have done better than she has. I see some people are saying that she's got her eye on polishing her marble with the president because he is the one who will appoint a successor to Busisiwe Mkhwebane in October this year. I think that is probably a little bit unfair. But I think that, it's like the marks at school. You could do better, and she could have done better than she has done. She seems to have interpreted her mandate very narrowly, and she also seems to have sort of glided over a lot of terminology, which we've discussed in this interview, which she ought to have considered a bit more in depth and carefully.
Advocate Paul Hoffman, we'll leave it there for tonight. So by all indications then, this particular story far from over. It's going to be interesting to see how those cases, the review cases, pan out in court, and also what the country's courts, their interpretation of what has happened takes place. Undoubtedly will probably end up at the Constitutional Court.
The recurring theme, though, is that every South African president has their own public protector's report that ultimately becomes one of the most defining moments at this stage